on the nature of that imitation which takes place in what are called the imitative arts. Introduction. That Adam Smith had never neglected to cultivate a taste for the fine arts, we are assured by Douglas Stewart. That he was writing a book on the imitative arts about 10 years before his death, we know from Smith's own admission. But what was the precise relation of that work to well-attested earlier efforts on the one hand, and to the essay posthumously published the other, is a question to which we shall probably never know the answer. Since the sources of our information concerning this matter cast some light on the larger question of the great work Smith at one time contemplated, it may be worthwhile to study them in some detail. Neither in his early letter to Hume, letter 137 dated 16 April 1773, nor in the later one to La Rochefoucauld, letter 248 dated 1 November 1785, did Smith refer specifically to any study of the imitative arts. But in October 1780, in a letter to Andreas Holt, commissioner of the Danish Board of Trade, occurs a passage that casts light on more than one question relating to the essays on philosophical subjects, and above all on the one we are at present concerned with. In 1773, Smith recalls, he had had to go to London in connection with an office that on the Duke of Buccleuch's advice he had turned down. For 4 years after this, Smith continued, London was my principal residence, where I finished and published my book, Wealth of Nations. I had returned to my old retirement at Kirkcaldy and was employing myself in writing another work concerning the imitative arts. He concluded this letter with an expression of regret that, owing to the duties of his new office, Commissioner of H.M. Customs in Edinburgh, several works which I had projected are likely to go on much more slowly than they otherwise would have done. In the year 1781, following that of the letter just quoted, Henry Mackenzie wrote to a Mr. Carmichael that Smith had lying by him several essays, some finished, but the greater part not quite completed on subjects of criticism and belles lettres. Mackenzie, author of The Man of Feeling, was one of the most distinguished of contemporary Scottish men of letters. In commenting on this letter, Scott, ASSP, and note, says that he acted on behalf of Adam Smith's literary executors in preparing his essays for publication. Unfortunately, Mackenzie's reference to the essays is limited to the above quotation. Apart from Smith's letter to La Rochefoucauld, no evidence as to the progress of the essays is available before the time of their author's death, 1790, when letters of condolence were written to Smith's nephew and principal legatee. In one of these letters, from Lord Loughborough, there occurs the following paragraph. The disposition of his unprinted works is exactly what I expected, as he told me it was his determination to destroy the greater part of them, and he particularly accepted the history of astronomy and his treatise on the imitative arts. The last I had seen when he was in London, but I understood it had since received some alterations. The first I had not seen for many years, but understood from conversation that he had been employed in correcting it. Unfortunately, there is no indication which year it was during Smith's residence in London that Lord Loughborough had seen the arts essay, but Smith's proposed preservation of it, in addition to the astronomy, the only one named in letter 137 to Hume, implies that it was on a later visit than the one Smith refers to in the letter addressed to Andreas Holt, perhaps during the visit of 1787 referred to by Professor E.C. Mosner in the biographical approach. If this were all the evidence we had on the composition of the essay on the imitative arts, the conclusion would be tolerably clear. It was written at Kirkcaldy about 1777, seen in London thereafter, and subsequently altered. Unfortunately, an element of doubt, though not a conclusive one, is introduced by John Miller, professor of law at Glasgow, who in a letter to David Douglas, written a few days before that of Lord Loughborough, stated that of the discourses which he intended upon the imitative arts. He read two to our society at Glasgow, Barwa. But the third was not then finished. This reference to two parts and an unfinished third is a plausible description of the essay in appendix as posthumously printed. Oui. Now Smith left the Glasgow chair in 1764, about 14 years before he wrote it. At its face value, then, Miller's evidence implies either that Smith composed it long before he wrote it, or that he communicated to the Glasgow Society during a later visit what he had written in 1777. Since Scott could find no record of these papers in the printed extracts from the minutes of the Glasgow Society, it is impossible to decide between these alternatives. Professor D. Raphael regards it as most probable that Smith read earlier versions to the Society and was subsequently able to amplify and confirm his theories as a result of his visit to France. That this was a not uncommon procedure is evidenced by the fact that Joseph Black's only publication of his epoch-making discovery of latent heat was to a Society of Professors at Glasgow in 1762. Miller's description may have been a conflation of two reminiscences separated by a long period of time. In the same letter, Miller wrote, "Of all his writing, I have most curiosity about the metaphysical work you mention. I should like to see his powers of illustration employed upon the true old Humean philosophy. On this Scott comments, there is no trace of this MS, but I agree with Professor Raphael, who kindly drew my attention to this letter, that in view of the word illustration, cf. the titles of the three historical essays, the metaphysical MS could have been no other than that of these essays. Professor Raphael sees in Miller's comment some confirmation of his own view that Smith was greatly influenced by Hume's new attitude to the faculty of imagination. I have dealt with this more fully in my essay, Adam Smith and the History of Ideas. See also D. Raphael's Impartial Spectator, both in essays on Adam Smith. Though Douglas Stewart's life deals with Smith's work on the imitative arts in terms too general to yield any significant guide to its dating, the continuation of the passage quoted above provides an important insight into the working of Smith's mind. He had never neglected to cultivate a taste for the fine arts, less, it is probable, with a view to the peculiar enjoyments they convey, than on account of their connection with the general principles of the human mind. To those who speculate on this very delicate subject, the comparison of the modes of taste that prevail among different nations affords a valuable collection of facts. Mr. Smith may naturally be supposed to have availed himself of every opportunity which a foreign country afforded him of illustrating his former theories. The foreign country to which Stewart refers was of course France, where Smith travelled as the companion of the Duke of Buccleuch during the greater part of the period 1764–6. Among the former theories, Stewart included Smith's peculiar notions with respect to the imitative arts, especially his belief that the pleasure provided by these arts was chiefly due to the difficulty of the imitation. That Stewart must at least have discussed these matters with Smith from time to time we may infer from his reference to the latter's sustained interest in the principles of dramatic composition and the history of the theatre, had furnished him with some of the most remarkable facts on which his theory of the imitative arts was founded. He had, so Stewart claimed, devoted leisure hours to the study of the drama, and he intended, if he had lived, to have prepared the result of these labours for the press. Of this work he has left for publication a short fragment. but he had not proceeded far enough to apply his doctrine to versification and to the theatre. What the relation was between this short fragment and the essay on the imitative arts, to which Stuart makes no specific reference, is not made clear. The appendix on the affinity between music, dancing, and poetry could have been conceived as a bridge passage between the main essay and the unachieved work on dramatic composition and the theatre. If this was not the case, then Smith's editors must have decided not to print the fragment to which Stuart refers. In view of such occasional imprecision, and in some cases even inconsistency, Stuart's account should not be relied on exclusively for the detailed facts of Smith's life and works. The date of the composition of this essay has a special interest in relation to one of those asides that some modern readers may find the most rewarding features of these early works. Towards the end of his discussion of the visual arts, Smith draws attention to the significance of rarity and costliness in the appreciation of works of art, especially of those arts which address themselves, not to the prudent and the wise, but to the rich and the great, to the proud and the vain. Smith illustrates this point by reminding the reader of the esteem in which topiary had some years ago been held. The alleged ground of its contemporary rejection, unnaturalness, was, he maintained, unconvincing. The true reason was that the rich and the great will not admit into their gardens an ornament which the meanest of the people can have as well as they. This judgment, supported by cogent analysis and just analogy, was surely an early appreciation of one aspect of Thorstein Veblen's pecuniary canons of taste. Chapter 4 of his Theory of the Leisured Class, 1899, where he writes, "The marks of expensiveness come to be accepted as beautiful features of the expensive articles." Smith's emphasis is on exclusiveness rather than on money value, but he was writing of England and France in the 18th century, Veblen of America more than a century later. This remarkable insight into the social relativity of aesthetic norms is accompanied in the same context by what may have been an almost second sight into a changing zeitgeist. Zeitgeist. In an uncommonly familiar vein, Smith begs the reader, next time he sees examples of topiary, to restrain for a few minutes the foolish passion for playing the critic, when he will be sensible that they are not without some degree of beauty. In fact, Smith is not asking for a suspension of criticism, but for a flexibility in relation to critical standards. In 1797, Wackenroder would in effect censure the age of condemning the Middle Ages because they do not build the same kind of temples as Greece. 12 years later, August von Schlegel rejected the despotism of good taste. As the 19th century advanced, the form of medieval hierarchialism characteristic of 18th century classicism was giving way to the romantic adventure of ideas. In 1776, Adam Smith had reminded the world of the still unrealized possibilities of economic expansion and cultural change consequent on the discovery of America. It would be interesting to know when there came to him the first urge to extend the horizon of taste in the arts. Whenever it may have been, it remained an incongruity in an essay that, as some of the subsequent notes will show, remained firmly set in the unimaginative cultural atmosphere of the Age of Reason. There is, however, in the question implied in the title, what are called the imitative arts, one other aspect of the essay which has a relevance out with the context in which it is applied. This is Smith's recognition of the possibility of what we might call an innate semantic confusion. For his analysis of the nature of the imitation shows that although, at least for the age in which he was writing, a degree of imitation is an essential aim, yet its complete achievement, as in mechanical duplication, is self-defeating. Though each reader may have some reservations as to the correctness of Smith's individual judgments, the polished lucidity of their expression and the unified structure in which they are embedded lend support to the belief that this essay is the product of a mature understanding. Its preservation adds an important item to the evidence that the author of The Wealth of Nations was not only a genius, but one of unusual complexity and fascination, about whom the last word will not be spoken for a long time to come. Of the nature of that imitation which takes place in what are called the imitative arts. Part 1. The most perfect imitation of an object of any kind must in all cases, it is evident, be another object of the same kind, made as exactly as possible after the same model. What, for example, would be the most perfect imitation of the carpet which now lies before me? Another carpet, certainly, wrought as exactly as possible after the same pattern. But whatever might be the merit or beauty of this second carpet, it would not be supposed to derive any from the circumstance of its having been made in imitation of the first. This circumstance of its being not an original, but a copy, would even be considered as some diminution of that merit, a greater or smaller, in proportion as the object was of a nature to lay claim to a greater or smaller degree of admiration. It would not much diminish the merit of a common carpet, because in such trifling objects, which at best can lay claim to so little beauty or merit of any kind, we do not always think it worth while to affect originality. It would diminish a good deal that of a carpet of very exquisite workmanship. In objects of still greater importance, this exact, or as it would be called, this servile imitation, would be considered as the most unpardonable blemish. To build another St. Peter's or St. Paul's Church, of exactly the same dimensions, proportions, and ornaments with the present buildings at Rome or London, would be supposed to argue such a miserable barrenness of genius and invention as would disgrace the most expensive magnificence. J'arrive dans 2 secondes. The exact resemblance of the correspondent parts of the same object is frequently considered as a beauty, and the want of it as a deformity. As in the correspondent members of the human body, in the opposite wings of the same building, in the opposite trees of the same alley, in the correspondent compartments of the same piece of carpet work, or of the same flower garden, in the chairs or tables which stand in the correspondent parts of the same room, etc. But in objects of the same kind, which in other respects are regarded together separate and unconnected, this exact resemblance is seldom considered as a beauty, nor the want of it as a deformity. A man, and in the same manner a horse, is handsome or ugly, each of them, on account of his own intrinsic beauty or deformity, without any regard to their resembling or not resembling the one another man or the other another horse. A set of coach horses, indeed, is supposed to be handsomer when they are all exactly matched. But each horse is, in this case, considered not as a separated and unconnected object, or as a whole by himself, but as a part of another whole, to the other parts of which he ought to bear a certain correspondence. Separated from the set, he derives neither beauty from his resemblance, nor deformity from his unlikeness to the other horses which compose it. Even in the correspondent parts of the same object, we frequently require no more than a resemblance in the general outline. If the inferior members of those correspondent parts are too minute to be seen distinctly, without a separate and distinct examination of each part by itself, as a separate and unconnected object, we should sometimes even be displeased if the resemblance was carried beyond this general outline. In the correspondent parts of a room we frequently hang pictures of the same size. Those pictures, however, resemble one another in nothing but the frame, or perhaps in the general character of the subject. If the one is a landscape, the other is a landscape too. If the one represents a religious or a bacchanalian subject, its companion represents another of the same kind. Nobody ever thought of repeating the same picture in each correspondent frame. The frame and the general character of two or three pictures is as much as the eye can comprehend at one view or from one station. Each picture, in order to be seen distinctly and understood thoroughly, must be viewed from a particular station and examined by itself as a separate and unconnected object. In a hall or portico, adorned with statues, the niches, or perhaps the pedestals, may exactly resemble one another, but the statues are always different. Even the masks which are sometimes carried upon the different keystones of the same arcade, or of the correspondent doors and windows of the same front, though they may all resemble one another in the general outline, yet each of them has always its own peculiar features and a grimace of its own. There are some Gothic buildings in which the correspondent windows resemble one another only in the general outline, and not in the smaller ornaments and subdivisions. These are different in each, and the architect had considered them as too minute to be seen distinctly, without a particular and separate examination of each window by itself, as a separate and unconnected object. A variety of this sort, however, I think, is not agreeable. In objects which are susceptible only of a certain inferior order of beauty, such as the frames of pictures, the niches or the pedestals of statues, etc., there seems frequently to be affectation in the study of variety, of which the merit is scarcely ever sufficient to compensate the want of that perspicuity and distinctness, of that easiness to be comprehended and remembered. Each is the natural effect of exact uniformity. In a portico of the Corinthian or Ionic order, each column resembles every other, not only in the general outline, but in all the minutest ornaments, though some of them, in order to be seen distinctly, may require a separate and distinct examination in each column, and in the entablature of each intercolumnation. In the inlaid tables, which, according to the present fashion, are sometimes fixed in the correspondent parts of the same room, the pictures only are different in each. All of the other more frivolous and fanciful ornaments are commonly, so far at least as I have observed the fashion, the same in them all. Those ornaments, however, in order to be seen distinctly, require a separate and distinct examination of each table. The extraordinary resemblance of two natural objects, of twins, for example, is regarded as a curious circumstance, which, though it does not increase, yet does not diminish the beauty of either, considered as a separate and unconnected object. But the exact resemblance of two productions of art seems to be always considered as some diminution of the merit of at least one of them, as it seems to prove that one of them, at least, is a copy either of the other, or of some other original. One may say even of the copy of a picture that it derives its merit, not so much from its resemblance to the original, as from its resemblance to the object which the original was meant to resemble. The owner of the copy, so far from setting any high value upon its resemblance to the original, is often anxious to destroy any value or merit which it might derive from this circumstance. He is often anxious to persuade both himself and other people that it is not a copy, but an original, of which what passes for the original is only a copy. But whatever merit a copy may derive from its resemblance to the original, an original can certainly derive none from the resemblance of its copy. But though a production of art seldom derives any merit from its resemblance to another object of the same kind, it frequently derives a great deal from its resemblance to an object of a different kind, whether that object be a production of art or of nature. A painted cloth, the work of some laborious Dutch artist, so curiously shaded and colored as to represent the bile and softness of a woolen one, might derive some merit from its resemblance even to the sorry carpet which now lies before me. The copy might, and probably would, in this case, be of much greater value than the original. But if this carpet was represented as spread either upon a floor or upon a table, and projecting from the background of the picture, with exact observation of perspective and of light and shade, the merit of the imitation would be still greater. In painting, a plane surface of one kind is made to resemble, not only a plane surface of another, but all of the three dimensions of a solid substance. In statuary and sculpture, a solid substance of one kind is made to resemble a solid substance of another. The disparity between the objects imitating and the object imitated is much greater in the one art than in the other, and the pleasure arising from the imitation seems to be greater in proportion as this disparity is greater. In painting, the imitation frequently pleases, though the original object be indifferent or even offensive. In statuary and sculpture it is otherwise. The imitation seldom pleases, unless the original object be in a very high degree either great, or beautiful or interesting. A butcher's stall or a kitchen dresser, with the objects which they commonly present, are not certainly the happiest subjects, even for painting. They have, however, been represented with so much care and success by some Dutch masters that it is impossible to view the pictures without some degree of pleasure. They would be most absurd subjects for statuary or sculpture, which are, however, capable of representing them. The picture of a very ugly or deformed man, such as Aesop or Scarron, might not make a disagreeable piece of furniture. The statue certainly would. Even a vulgar ordinary man or woman, engaged in a vulgar ordinary action, like what we see with so much pleasure in the pictures of Rembrandt, would be too mean a subject for statuary. Jupiter, Hercules, and Apollo, Venus and Diana, the nymphs and the Graces, Bacchus, Mercury, Antinous and Meleager, the miserable death of Laocoon, the melancholy fate of the children of Niobe and the wrestlers, the fighting, the dying gladiator, the figures of gods and goddesses, of heroes and heroines, the most perfect forms of the human body, placed either in the noblest attitudes or in the most interesting situations which the human imagination is capable of conceiving, are the proper, and therefore have always been the favorite subjects of statuary. That art cannot, without degrading itself, stoop to represent anything that is offensive, or mean, or even indifferent. Painting is not so disdainful, and though capable of representing the noblest objects, it can, without forfeiting its title to please, submit to imitate those of a much more humble nature. The merit of the imitation alone, and without any merit in the imitated object, is capable of supporting the dignity of painting. It cannot support that of statuary. There would seem, therefore, to be more merit in the one species of imitation than in the other. In statuary, scarcely any drapery is agreeable. The best of the ancient statues were either altogether naked or almost naked, and those of which any considerable part of the body is covered are represented as clothed in wet linen, a species of clothing which most certainly never was agreeable to the fashion of any country. This drapery, too, is drawn so tight as to express beneath its narrow foldings the exact form and outline of any limb, and almost of every muscle of the body. The clothing which thus approached the nearest to no clothing at all had, it seems, in the judgment of the great artists of antiquity, been that which was most suitable to statuary. A great painter of the Roman school, who had formed his manner almost entirely upon the study of the ancient statues, imitated at first their drapery in his pictures, but he soon found that in painting it had the air of meanness and poverty, as if the persons who wore it could scarce afford clothes enough to cover them, and that larger folds and a looser and more flowing drapery were more suitable to the nature of his art. In painting, the imitation of so very inferior an object as a suit of clothes is capable of pleasing, and in order to give this object all the magnificence of which it is capable, it is necessary that the folds should be large, loose, and flowing. It is not necessary in painting that the exact form and outline of every limb and almost of every muscle of the body should be expressed beneath the folds of the drapery. It is sufficient if these are so disposed as to indicate in general the situation and attitude of the principal limbs. Painting, by the mere force and merit of its imitation, can venture, without the hazard of displeasing, to substitute, upon many occasions, the inferior in the room of the superior object, by making the one, in this manner, cover and entirely conceal a great part of the other. Statuary can seldom venture to do this, but with the utmost reserve and caution, and the same drapery, which is noble and magnificent in the one art, appears clumsy and awkward in the other. Some modern artists, however, have attempted to introduce into statuary the drapery which is peculiar to painting. It may not, perhaps, upon every occasion, be quite so ridiculous as the marble periwigs in Westminster Abbey. But if it does not always appear clumsy and awkward, it is at best always insipid and uninteresting. It is not the want of colouring which hinders many things from pleasing in statuary which please in painting. It is the want of that degree of disparity between the imitating and the imitated object which is necessary in order to render interesting the imitation of an object which is itself not interesting. Colouring, when added to statuary, so far from increasing, destroys almost entirely the pleasure which we receive from the imitation, because it takes away the great source of that pleasure, the disparity between the imitating and the imitated object. That one solid and coloured object should exactly resemble another solid and coloured object, seems to be a matter of no great wonder or admiration. A painted statue, though it certainly may resemble a human figure much more exactly than any statue which is not painted, is generally acknowledged to be a disagreeable and even an offensive object. And so far are we from being pleased with this superior likeness, that we are never satisfied with it, and after viewing it again and again, we always find that it is not equal to what we are disposed to imagine it might have been. Though it should seem to want scarce anything but the life, we could not pardon it for thus wanting what it is altogether impossible it should have. The works of Mrs. Patience Wright, born in New Jersey in 1725, moved to London in 1772, and remained there until her death in 1786. Her wax models, many life-sized, had a great vogue. The London Magazine for 1775 printed a notice of her work. A self-taught artist of great merit are perhaps more perfect in this way than anything I have ever seen. They do admirably well to be seen now and then as a show, but the best of them we should find, if brought home to our own house and placed in a situation where it was to come often into view, would make, instead of an ornamental, a most offensive piece of household furniture. Painted statues, accordingly, are universally reprobated, and we scarce ever meet with them. To colour the eyes of statues is not altogether so uncommon. Even this, however, is disapproved by all good judges. I cannot bear it, a gentleman used to say, of great knowledge and judgment in this art. I cannot bear it. I always want them to speak to me. Artificial fruits and flowers sometimes imitate so exactly the natural objects which they represent that they frequently deceive us. We soon grow weary of them, however, and though they seem to want nothing but the freshness and the flavour of natural fruits and flowers, we cannot pardon them in the same manner for thus wanting what it is altogether impossible they should have. But we do not grow weary of a good flower and fruit painting. We do not grow weary of the foliage of the Corinthian Capitol, or of the flowers which sometimes ornament the frieze of that order. Such imitations, however, never deceive us. Their resemblance to the original objects is always much inferior to that of artificial fruits and flowers. Such as it is, however, we are contented with it. And where there is such disparity between the imitating and the imitated objects, we find that it is as great as it can be, or as we expect that it should be. Paint that foliage and those flowers with the natural colours, and instead of pleasing more, they will please much less. The resemblance, however, will be much greater, but the disparity between the imitating and the imitated objects will be so much less, that even this superior resemblance will not satisfy us. Where the disparity is very great, on the contrary, we are often contented with the most imperfect resemblance. With the very imperfect resemblance, for example, both as to figure and colour, of fruits and flowers in shell work. It may be observed, however, that, though in sculpture the imitation of flowers and foliage pleases as an ornament of architecture, as a part of the dress which is to set off the beauty of a different and a more important object, it would not please alone, or as a separate and unconnected object, in the same manner as a fruit and flower painting pleases. Flowers and foliage, how elegant and beautiful soever, are not sufficiently interesting. They have not dignity enough, if I may say so, to be proper subjects for a piece of sculpture, which is to please alone, and not as the ornamental appendage of some other object. In tapestry and needlework, in the same manner as in painting, a plain surface is sometimes made to represent all the three dimensions of a solid substance. But both the shuttle of the weaver and the needle of the embroiderer are instruments of imitation so much inferior to the pencil of the painter, that we are not surprised to find a proportionable inferiority in their productions. We have all more or less experienced that they usually are much inferior, and in appreciating a piece of tapestry or needlework, we never compare the imitation of either with that of a good picture, for it never could stand that comparison, but with that of other pieces of tapestry or needlework. We take into consideration not only the disparity between the imitating and the imitated object, but the awkwardness of the instruments of imitation. And if it is as well as anything that can be expected from these, if it is better than the greater part of what actually comes from them, we are often not only contented but highly pleased. A good painter will often execute in a few days a subject which would employ the best tapestry weaver for many years. Though, in proportion to his time, therefore, the latter is always much worse paid than the former, yet his work in the end comes commonly much dearer to market. The great expense of good tapestry, the circumstance which confines it to the palaces of princes and great lords, gives it, in the eyes of the greater part of people, an air of riches and magnificence, which contributes still further to compensate the imperfection of its imitation. In arts which addresses themselves, not to the prudent and the wise, but to the rich and the great, to the proud and the vain, we ought not to wonder if the appearance of great expense, of being what few people can purchase, of being one of the surest characteristics of great fortune, should often stand in the place of exquisite beauty, and contribute equally to recommend their productions. Of the produce of land which sometimes does, and sometimes does not, afford rent, where this point is elaborated. Smith remarks of the rich: "In their eyes the merit of an object which is in any degree either useful or beautiful is greatly enhanced by its scarcity, or by the great labor which it requires to collect any considerable quantity of it, a labor which nobody can afford to pay but themselves. Such objects they are willing to purchase at a higher price than things much more beautiful and useful, but more common." Histoire de l'art contemporain. As the idea of expense seems often to embellish, so that of cheapness seems as frequently to tarnish the lustre even of very agreeable objects. The difference between real and false jewels is what even the experienced eye of a jeweller can sometimes with difficulty distinguish. Let an unknown lady, however, come into a public assembly with a headdress which appears to be very richly adorned with diamonds, and let a jeweller only whisper in our ear that they are all false stones. Not only the lady will immediately sink in our imagination from the rank of a princess to that of a very ordinary woman, but the headdress, from an object of the most splendid magnificence, will at once become an impertinent piece of tawdry and tinsel finery. It was some years ago the fashion to ornament a garden with yew and holly trees, clipped into the artificial shapes of pyramids, and columns and vases and obelisks. It is now the fashion to ridicule this taste as unnatural. The figure of a pyramid or obelisk, however, is not more natural to a yew tree than to a block of porphyry or marble. When the yew tree is pretended to the eye in this artificial shape, the gardener does not mean that it should be understood to have grown in that shape. He means first to give it the same beauty of regular figure which pleases so much in porphyry and marble, and secondly, to imitate in a growing tree the ornaments of those precious materials. He means to make an object of one kind resemble another object of a very different kind, and to the original beauty of figure to join the relative beauty of imitation. But the disparity between the imitating and the imitated object is the foundation of the beauty of imitation. It is because the one object does not naturally resemble the other that we are so much pleased with it, when by art it is made to do so. The shears of the gardener, it may be said, indeed, are very clumsy instruments of sculpture. They are so, no doubt, when employed to imitate the figures of men or even of animals. But in the simple and regular forms of pyramids, vases, and obelisks, even the shears of the gardener do well enough. Some allowance, too, is naturally made for the necessary imperfection of the instrument, in the same manner as in tapestry and needlework. In short, the next time you have an opportunity of surveying those out-of-fashion ornaments, endeavour only to let yourself alone, and to restrain for a few minutes the foolish passion for playing the critic, and you will be sensible that they are not without some degree of beauty, that they give the air of neatness and correct culture at least to the whole garden, and that they are not unlike what the retired leisure that, as Milton says, in trim gardens takes his pleasure, might be amused with. What then, it may be said, has brought them into such universal disrepute among us? In a pyramid or obelisk of marble, we know that the materials are expensive, and that the labor which wrought them into that shape must have been still more so. In a pyramid or obelisk of yew, we know that the materials could cost very little, and the labor still less. The former are enabled by their expense, the latter degraded by their cheapness. In the cabbage garden of a tallow chandler we may sometimes perhaps have seen as many columns and vases, and other ornaments in yew, as there are in marble and porphyry at Versailles. It is this vulgarity which has disgraced them. The rich and the great, the proud and the vain, will not admit into their gardens an ornament which the meanest of the people can have as well as they. With the greater part of rich people, the chief enjoyment of riches consists in the parade of riches, which in their eyes is never so co- complete as when they appear to possess those decisive marks of opulence which nobody can possess but themselves. The taste for these ornaments came originally from France, where, notwithstanding that inconsistency of fashion with which we sometimes reproach the natives of that country, it still continues in good repute. In France, the conditions of the inferior ranks of people is seldom so happy as it frequently is in England. The wages of labour are lower in France than in England. When you go from Scotland to England, the difference which you may remark between the dress and countenance of the common people in the one country and in the other sufficiently indicates the difference in their condition. The contrast is still greater when you return from France. And you will very seldom find even pyramids and obelisks of you in the garden of a tallow chandler. Such ornaments, not having in that country been degraded by their vulgarity, have not yet been excluded from the gardens of princes and great lords. The works of the great masters in statuary and painting, it is to be observed, never produce their effect by deception. They never are, and it never is intended that they should be mistaken for the real objects which they represent. Painted statuary may sometimes deceive an inattentive eye. Proper statuary never does. The little pieces of perspective in painting, which it is intended should please by deception, represent always some very simple as well as insignificant object. A roll of paper, for example, or the steps of a staircase in the dark corner of some passage or gallery. They are generally the works, too, of some very inferior artists. After being seen once, and producing the little surprise which it is meant they should excite, together with the mirth which commonly accompanies it, they never please more, but appear ever after insipid and tiresome. The proper pleasure which we derive from those two imitative arts, so far from being the effect of deception, is altogether incompatible with it. That pleasure is founded altogether upon our wonder at seeing an object of one kind represent so well an object of a very different kind, and upon our admiration of the art which surmounts so happily that disparity which nature had established between them. The nobler works of statuary and painting appear to us a sort of wonderful phenomena, differing in this respect from the wonderful phenomena of nature, that they carry, as it were, their own explication along with them, and demonstrate, even to the eye, the way and manner in which they are produced. The eye, even of an unskilful spectator, immediately discerns, in some measure, how it is that a certain modification of figure in statuary, and of brighter and darker colours in painting, can represent, with so much truth and vivacity, the actions, passions, and behaviour of men, as well as a great variety of other objects. The pleasing wonder of ignorance is accompanied with the still more pleasing satisfaction of science. We wonder and are amazed at the effect, and we are pleased ourselves, and happy to find that we can comprehend, in some measure, how that wonderful effect is produced. A good looking glass represents the objects which are set before it with much more truth and vivacity than either statuary or painting. But, though the science of optics may explain to the understanding, the looking glass itself does not at all demonstrate to the eye how this effect is brought about. It may excite the wonder of ignorance, and in a clown, who had never beheld a looking glass before, I have seen that wonder rise almost to rapture and ecstasy, but it cannot give the satisfaction of science. In all looking glasses the effects are produced by the same means, applied exactly in the same manner. In every different statue and picture the effects are produced, though both similar, yet not by the same means. And those means, too, are applied in a different manner in each. Every good statue and picture is a fresh wonder, which at the same time carries, in some measure, its own explication along with it. After a little use and experience, all looking glasses cease to be wonders altogether, and even the ignorant become so familiar with them as not to think that their effects require any explication. A looking glass, besides, can represent only present objects, and, when the wonder is once fairly over, we choose, in all cases, rather to contemplate the substance than to gaze at the shadow. One's own face becomes then the most agreeable object which a looking glass can represent to us, and the only object which we do not soon grow weary with looking at. It is the only present object of which we can see only the shadow, whether handsome or ugly, whether old or young. It is the face of a friend always, of which the features correspond exactly with whatever sentiment, emotion, or passion we may happen at that moment to feel. In statuary, the means by which the wonderful effect is brought about appear more simple and obvious than in painting. Where the disparity between the imitating and the imitated object being much greater, the art which can conquer that greater disparity appears evidently, and almost to the eye, to be founded upon a much deeper science, or upon principles much more abstruse and profound. Even in the meanest subjects we can often trace with pleasure the ingenious means by which painting surmounts this disparity. But we cannot do this in statuary, because the disparity not being so great, the means do not appear so ingenious, and it is upon this account that in painting we are often delighted with the representation of many things, which in statuary would appear insipid, tiresome, and not worth the looking at. It ought to be observed, however, that though in statuary the art of imitation appears in many respects inferior to what it is in painting, yet in a room ornamented with both statues and pictures of nearly equal merit, we shall generally find that the statues draw off our eye from the pictures. There is generally but one, or little more than one, point of view from which a picture can be seen with advantage, and it always presents to the eye precisely the same object. There are many different points of view from which a statue may be seen with equal advantage, and from each it presents a different object. There is more variety in the pleasure which we receive from a good statue than in that which we receive from a good picture, and one statue may frequently be the subject of many good pictures or drawings, all different from one another. The shadowy relief and projection of a picture, besides, is much flattened, and seems almost to vanish away altogether when brought into comparison with the real and solid body which stands by it. How nearly soever these two arts may seem to be akin, they accord so very ill with one another, that their different projections ought, perhaps, scarce ever to be seen together. Part 2, ça fait une. C'est comme 21 pages. Partie 2. La partie 3 fait que 3 pages. La partie 2 fait 21 pages, la partie 3, 3 pages. Bon, je vous dis à dans 1 heure, je pense.